Hi everybody, welcome back. Today we are talking about first aid for your reptiles, or more generally, what kind of equipment and supplies are helpful to have on hand in case of emergencies and just general healthcare for your reptiles. So I am going to get started with what I tend to have on hand. I will highlight in places I have a couple of products that I'm aware are only available in the UK and are not available in the US. So do check what's available to you locally and whether there is a reasonable alternative if the products that I talk about are not available in your region. So I'm going to get started just with wound care. So for example, it's quite often the case that you might have minor injuries on your snake or your reptile. They might have little abrasions or scrapes or cuts. They might have a little bit of torn skin perhaps if they've had a bit of an imperfect shed. Now, generally speaking, of course, it's important to bear in mind that if you believe that your animal is sick or they have a serious injury, it's always important to consult a vet and get your animal checked out. But for very minor scrapes and abrasions where there's no indication of things like infection or contamination, and the wound does not appear to be, open, then in many cases you will be able to deal with this yourself with the appropriate supplies. So first of all, I'm going to start with a fairly standard thing for most reptile keepers, and that is betadine. Now, betadine is basically just iodine. It's iodine that in particular has no additional anti-inflammatories or painkillers in it. This is important because anti-inflammatories and painkillers that are safe for mammals are incredibly dangerous and often toxic to reptiles. So it's important that you get an iodine that is safe for reptiles and has no additional components in it. Now, of course, betadine is a product name. There are other options. So for example, you might just get a more general iodine solution, but do make sure that the iodine does not have any other components or additives in it. Iodine is essentially a disinfectant. What you can do with this is you can use it in various degrees of dilution, especially for betadine, to clean and sanitize an injury. So betadine, do pay attention to the dilution recommendations on the product. Generally speaking, neat or very strong solutions are only really recommended for an initial cleaning and should be rinsed off because it's quite a burning sensation. Iodine is quite strong, and more dilute solutions can be used to clean an animal down for less serious injuries and just to rinse off where you've already sanitized a wound. So, betadine. Other things that I find useful to have is this. Now, this is lucillin. This, again, is an antiseptic. Now, it's an antiseptic, it's an antibacterial. It is safe for mammals, birds, and reptiles, as you can see here. And this is something that is commonly used by vets as well, because it is safe for essentially all kinds of animals. Now, as you see here, it's steroid-free, it's antibiotic-free, and in this sense, it's safe for these more sensitive types of animals like birds and reptiles. So I would recommend having lucillin. Again, this is a good way to clean injuries, wipe down an animal if you are concerned that they have a minor abrasion or some kind of scrape or injury, and this is a very good way to clean a wound. On the topic of cleaning, other things that are, again, industry staples are disinfectants. So everything here is an antiseptic or for wound cleaning. But for cleaning more generally, for example, if you wanted to clean surfaces, you would use something like this. Now, this is F10. Again, this is a safe veterinary disinfectant. It's safe for all groups of animals. You can see here, it's also safe for reptiles and birds. Now, this is concentrate. I tend to buy the concentrate and then make it up myself. Again, there are some guidelines as to the dilution ratios, but I use F10 in all sorts of ways. So I have it in a spray bottle to disinfect surfaces if I'm cleaning enrichment or I'm cleaning an enclosure. It's worth pointing out that F10 is not itself a cleaner. So you should not, for example, just spray F10 onto something that has dirt or contaminants in it. It's important that you clean the surface first and then use F10 as a disinfectant. Now, F10 is safe insofar as you do not need to rinse it off. So as long as you use a relatively dilute, appropriate dilution, you can spray and wipe down enclosures and enrichment, and you do not then have to rinse it off. But do be careful with the dilution ratio, and do bear in mind that F10 is a disinfectant, not a cleaning agent. Now, F10 comes in all kinds of forms. For example, you can also get F10 wipes. Again, I tend to get refills for this, and then I use a dilution of the liquid to obviously fill this up. But I tend to get these wipes because they're just really helpful when I am moving from enclosure to enclosure to not be carrying necessarily a spray bottle, or if I'm just cleaning down like spot cleaning or doing a small area. I find that the wipes are really helpful because I can simultaneously scoop up what it is that I'm cleaning. And there's a bit of mechanical cleaning there. As I mentioned, this is a disinfectant, not a cleaning agent, but the wipes do perform mechanical cleaning. You can, scrub and wipe and lift something away, and it will do that relatively well. Coming back to minor injuries or perhaps things like scale rot, I should point out if you have mild cases of scale rot, then lucillin and iodine are excellent for this. I'm about to then talk about a product here which is an F10 product, but I've been given to understand that it's not actually available in the US. So if you are in the US, apologies, you may not be able to get a hold of this product. But this is F10 gel. Now this is a clear gel. I'll just open it up so that you can see it. And it goes on a bit like a cream. Now, the useful thing about this, as you can see here, it's an ointment and it's a germicidal barrier. Now, it is not in itself a germicide. It is a disinfectant, just like other F10 is. But for example, I had Yig, one of my Western hognose snakes, did have a bout of scale rot about 1.5 years ago. And the way that I treated that was with the iodine, the betadine, to clean down the scale rot area. I then use lucillin as an antiseptic. This is also because lucillin is quite a good antifungal, iodine less so. So my treatment regimen involved cleaning the area with dilute iodine, rinsing that down with lucillin, drying off the area, and then putting some of this on the area as a germicidal barrier, just to make sure that no other contamination got into the area of scale rot, where obviously the integument is a bit damaged and it's much more vulnerable to reinfection from fungus and bacteria. Although, of course, she was in a quarantine tub at the time, but this was just a bit of extra protection to make sure that that healing was not interrupted by her perhaps getting other minor contaminants in there. So this, as far as I'm aware, is available in the UK. I don't know if it's available in Europe, but I've been told that it's not available in the US. So that's kind of our staples for things like minor injuries, and also to some extent for disinfecting mechanically their environment and their enrichment and their the things that you have, hides and so on, and water bowls. You can use F10. Other things that I tend to have available is mite spray. Now, I will have a caveat with this. I have never had mites in any of my animals. I'm very lucky, I realise, in that sense, in that it's not something I've ever had to deal with, but I do have mite spray available. This does come with a massive caveat and a caution, which is certain species of reptiles, in particular, in my case, hognose snakes, mite spray is incredibly dangerous and should not be used for them at all. It will kill your hognose. Certain other reptiles are also very, very sensitive to mite spray, so please do check and make sure that it is safe for use. I would recommend consulting with vets, breeders, and other experts in the species that you are concerned about to make sure that mite spray is an appropriate way to deal with the problem, and also that you are very cautious in making sure that any animal that has mites is carefully and well quarantined away from the rest of your animals if you have more than one. In the case of animals where mite spray is not appropriate, you can use Dawn dish soap. Now, Dawn dish soap is also used in removal of fleas in certain wildlife centres. Essentially, Dawn dish soap will mechanically remove the mites and drown them. You will have to do multiple treatments, but then you would also have to do multiple treatments with the mite spray as well. So there are other alternatives. If you do have mites, however, I would strongly recommend checking in with your vet, checking in to make sure that whatever treatment plan you are using, it's appropriate for the animal and that you have them well quarantined. And I would recommend checking, cleaning, sanitizing, and just making sure that any other enclosures or any other animals in your home are mite free. Okay, so these kind of are terms of more regular, just kind of day-to-day, perhaps less so with the mites, health concerns or issues like scale rot or minor injuries. Other things that I tend to keep around for perhaps more serious injuries, let's say, for example, as we enter the holiday period, you might have an animal that has an injury that you would like to get them to a vet, but it might be a little bit of time before you can get them there. So for example, you might need an emergency appointment. Maybe it's quite a significant injury and it's going to be maybe a day or more before you can get to an exotic vet to see your animal. There are a couple of options here. Again, I would use these with extreme caution and only if you have no better alternative. And also use these only in the instance where you have cleaned the injury thoroughly first. So if you have an open injury that is actively bleeding and you are very concerned and you cannot get to a vet within a safe or reasonable time frame, I mean in a matter of hours or a day, and the injury keeps reopening and keeps bleeding, there are a couple of things that you can do. First of all, we have styptic powder. So this is actually designed for cats and dogs. The idea here is that if, for example, you are trimming nails and you cut the quick, that will often bleed quite significantly. Styptic powder essentially is a coagulant, and it's just a plant-based powder that will clot and seal that wound. Now, it is very important that you check that the styptic powder you have available to you is safe for your animal. Some styptic powders do have additives in them like painkillers or anti-inflammatories. So do make sure that the styptic powder is 100% safe for reptiles. This powder that I have here is not one that I use for my reptiles. I've actually run out of the reptile safe one. This is one that I used to use when I kept pet rats. So this is for mammals, and you will see that it does have some, for example, desmopressin, and it has various other additives here, which I would not recommend using with reptiles, but you can get reptile safe styptic powder. And I have actually heard of people using corn flour as a styptic, because again, it's just something that will clot and clog up the bleeding such that it will form a seal and will stop them bleeding out. So with the caveat that this is not the styptic powder that I would recommend, but styptic powder is something that might be useful to have as an emergency backup if you need it. In a similar vein, I have this. This is MedBond. Generally speaking, this is only available from vets, but you can get it from some veterinary supply centres online. This is essentially superglue. As many people know, superglue was actually originally invented as a field dressing, and it does exactly what superglue does. If you've ever wondered why superglue sticks to your fingers better than almost anything else, that's why. Again, skin glue is only recommended, as it says here, deep puncture wounds. So long gashes, long open wounds, I would not recommend this. For lacerations and abrasions, for deep cuts that are relatively confined and small but are bleeding quite profusely, this can be very, very useful in emergency situations. And I do state emergency situations. Again, as with everything that I've mentioned here, make sure that it is a product that is safe for reptiles. Some types of Med Bond glue are not safe for reptiles. Some are only safe for mammals. So do check. I got this from my vet, and this was given to me as one that was safe for reptiles. So do double check that. But again, I would not recommend using these in the regular run of things. This is very much a rare situation, extreme emergency, if you must seal a wound quickly because you cannot get to a vet. So many caveats with that one. Other things that are useful to have just more generally. So I have here, these are just basic cotton medical dressings. So I would use these whenever I am, for example, applying the iodine or the lucillin, or if I'm wiping down or drying off an animal, I would use these. I have quite a few packs of these. And as you can see, they're in a sealed package to keep them clean. But generally speaking, I try to avoid using things like, tissue paper or paper towels, anything like that, because they can fragment. You can get little particulates that will break off of them and can end up contaminating an injury. So generally speaking, you want these kind of woven cotton pads that will not fray and will not leave any material in an injury. It's also helpful because when you buy them, they are sterile. So if you keep them sealed and you sanitize them, for example, with lucillin or F10 before you use them, they will be safe and will not introduce any additional contamination into an injury. So those are always good to have. Other more general supplies that I tend to have on hand, I brumate my hognose snakes. So that means that in winter, they get put into a wine cooler and they essentially sleep away the winter at fairly low temperatures. Their metabolism will slow down, so on and so forth. Some reptiles, when they come out of brumation, can be quite difficult to get eating again. It can be quite difficult to get their metabolism going again. They will get there eventually, but it can take a little bit of time. They can also sometimes be a little bit dehydrated. I do tend to offer mine water once a week when I check on them, but they may not always drink. So they can be a little bit low on hydration and electrolytes. So products that I tend to use for my animals, either if they have been unwell or after a long period of not eating, for example, during brumation, I have a variety of supplements. So I have Rectiboost, which is an electrolyte for snakes and reptiles. So all you do with this, or at least all I do, is I would dissolve some of this in their water, especially sort of the first water that I provide to them when they come out of brumation, just to give their metabolism a little bit of a boost and get them going again. Similarly, there is another similar product, which is Nitrobal. So Rectiboost is an electrolyte. This one essentially has calcium and multivitamins in it. So this is a mineral supplement, which again can be helpful if you have an animal that has been unwell off food for a prolonged period of time because they have been brumating or something like that. So that's kind of my standard kit. If you like, there's a few other bits and pieces that I tend to have on hand. So for example, these are not actually the ones that I use. The ones that I use are disinfected and sealed away in little bags, so I won't pull them out. But I do have a selection of paintbrushes of various sizes, and I use these to brush on things like iodine or lucillin in areas that are harder to get to, and where, for example, these might be a little bit overkill. Obviously, these are not the ones that I use because these are clearly not clean. The ones that I use have been disinfected and cleaned with F10 and various other products, and I keep them sealed in a little vacuum bag so that they are clean and sanitized for whenever I need them. But that can be helpful. It can be a lot more gentle and easy to brush on something like iodine or F10 or lucillin. If you have a small injury or an injury that's difficult for you to get to. It can also be gentler on the animal so that you're not putting too much mechanical stress on an injury or an area that might be a little bit sensitive. But again, be careful with this. Make sure that you use brushes with soft bristles that are made from natural materials that are, not old or worn, so you don't have bits of them falling off, and that you've made sure are clean and sanitized before you use them. Again, I use these instead of things like cotton buds, simply because cotton buds can, the Q-tips, I think they're called in the US, they can also fray a little bit more readily than a paintbrush would, and you can get small elements of contamination in injuries. I do also have a snake hook. Now, this is a really tiny snake hook, and that might seem a bit odd because most of my snakes are big enough that this would not be a helpful snake hook. The reason that I have this is not in fact to pick up my snakes. All of my snakes are very well socialized and have no problem with me just picking them up. They're very, very used to me. However, I do allow my snakes certain supervised, safe, snake-proofed, free roaming areas. This means that with smaller snakes like the hognoses or my young rat snake or even my young ball python, they can sometimes get themselves into places where it's more difficult for me to reach them. It's perfectly safe for them and I could get to them. If I, for example, pull something out of the way, it's not something that's a danger to them, but it's a little bit more awkward to get to them and I don't want to startle them. So I tend to use this snake hook to just kind of gently rub at them or prod, kind of alert them to the fact that I am going to bother them, that I'm going to come and pick them up so they know what's going on and they don't get stressed or alarmed about what's happening. So that's really the only time I tend to actually use a snake hook, which is why I have this very, very small one. But again, I have no strong opinions about the use of snake hooks. They are fine to use if they make you feel more comfortable, if they make it easier for you to handle your animal with confidence, use snake hooks. I tend not to use snake hooks for handling. I tend to engage in choice-based interaction and most of my animals are pretty comfortable with me. But again, learning to get comfortable with your animal is a process. And you also might want to gently encourage an animal out of something, out of a corner, out from under a hide, off of perhaps a bit of environment in their enclosure that they're climbing on and you don't want to pull at them because that would injure them. You can gently reach in and encourage them with a snake hook if that's helpful. And certainly I've done that too in the past. Other things that I tend to recommend are backup supplies. So these are just some examples. I tend to use halogens and I also use deep heat projectors. So I will usually have spares of those on hand just in case something burns out, runs out. When, for example, it's the holiday period and maybe shops are closed or it's going to be a few days before I can get replacement supplies. So I would recommend just having backup spares of those things. I also tend to keep these smaller halogens here, as well as the more regular size ones that I use in the enclosures, because I have these along with the little temporary lamp holders in case I need to quarantine an animal for any reason. So that might be an animal that is new to my reptile family, although it's been a long time since that happened, or in the case of, for example, a year or two ago when Yig had a minor case of scale rot, I needed to build her a quarantine enclosure and I wanted to make sure that she still had overhead heat and UV. So I have these smaller lamps with smaller lamp holders that I can use on a quarantine tub. But it's always good to have spare supplies just in case. Other staples are, of course, the classic heat probe. The batteries actually need replaced on this one that I just discovered today, right before filming this video. So I will be replacing those batteries a little later on. But just to check the temperatures at various points in your enclosure and often to check the temperature of your animal. So I do, of course, have probes in my enclosures, but they are sometimes a little bit inaccurate. And where you want to double check that your probe is still working correctly, or indeed that they are giving you a true reflection of the enclosure, and just check more generally what the ambient is. These are incredibly, incredibly helpful, and I would say an absolute must-have in terms of your supplies. As I mentioned, I do have some snakes that I brumate. Now, generally speaking, I am not great at regularly weighing my snakes. Once they get to a certain point that I'm confident that they are eating regularly, they're shedding, they're growing, they're putting on weight, I don't tend to weigh them terribly often. The one circumstance in which I do regularly weigh my animals is when they are brumating. It's very important for me to check that they're not losing too much weight and that they are in good condition throughout their brumation. They are expected, of course, to lose a little weight during brumation, but we don't want them losing too much so that they lose body condition. And to do that, I have just a good old-fashioned set of kitchen scales. You can tell that this is the one for snakes because I have a little snake vinyl sticker on it. This was actually, the sticker is from Etsy. I will check where I got these from in case you would like some and drop them down in the description. But just a standard set of kitchen scales, and I just have a simple, plastic Tupperware box to put the animals in and make sure that the weight is accurate. So I track their weight once a week when they are brumating. Oh, there we go. Other more general supplies that I tend to use, I mentioned previously that F10 is not in fact a cleaner, it is a disinfectant. So this means that I do need to have a cleaner. And of course, there's lots of different things that you can use that are safe for birds and reptiles, things like white vinegar. You can use, various other natural preparations like that. I've heard of people using baking soda. I mentioned already Dawn dish soap. On the more expensive end, you can get Hibiscrub. This is a cleaner that veterinarians use. It is quite strong though, and it's quite expensive. But you can, again, much like F10, you can buy it in a concentrated form and dilute it. But just be aware that it is quite powerful. You may want to be a little bit cautious with the dilution on that, and it can be quite expensive. So I do have some Hibiscrub, but to be honest with you, it's not what I tend to use in the normal run of things. I would tend to use it more often if, for example, I am setting up something like a quarantine enclosure, or I have particular concerns that an animal might be vulnerable to infection or contamination, where I would then use Hibiscrub, F10, and so on. For more general cleaning, I tend to use, this. Now, again, the brand isn't particularly important. What I have here is, this is again just a concentrate that I use to refill. The main thing here is that this is a cleaner that is safe for reptiles and birds. So Ecover uses kind of many of the things that are dangerous for amphibians, reptiles and birds. It does not use those products. It doesn't really matter what brand you get. There are a variety of ones available, but I would recommend finding a product that is safe, in particular for birds. Interestingly, at least in the UK, not all products will necessarily list as being safe for reptiles, but they will list as being safe for birds. Generally speaking, birds are just as, if not more sensitive to the same things that snakes and reptiles are. So I guess top tip, if it says it's safe for birds, then it will be safe for your reptiles as well. So I tend to use a more general cleaner like that for most day-to-day cleaning. You can see there again, I get the concentrate, so I can dilute it, I can put it in spray bottles, I can put it in, for example, wipe refills, things like that. And that's what I use for just usual run-of-the-mill routine cleaning. So I hope that's been helpful. I hope that helps you kind of think about what you want in your emergency kit. You may already have some of these products. You may already have all of these products. If there's things that I've not mentioned that you tend to keep in stock that you think would be useful, please do reach out and let me know. I would love to hear what you have in your, if you like, emergency or your maintenance kits. This is just most of the things that I tend to have. Please do let me know. If any of these are new to you, or if you have, for example, different alternatives that are available in your region instead of these products, please do let me know. I'm part of an international community of snake keepers, so it's always helpful for me to know what's regionally available versus what isn't, so that I can adjust and pass on that information accurately. Anyway, if you made it this far, thank you for bearing with me. A bit of a longer video today, but I just wanted to give a rundown of what I have available, especially as we go into the holiday period where it might be more difficult for us to access veterinary care, and we might just want to have that peace of mind of having our first aid kit available for our animals. So with that, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope this was helpful, and I hope to see you very soon in the next one.